The winter of 1945 was unlike any Europe had ever seen. Cities that had once been full of life now lay in ruins. The sound of laughter and music had long been replaced by the roar of distant artillery, the wail of air raid sirens, and the desperate whispers of men who knew the end was near. For the German soldiers still scattered across a crumbling Reich, there was no longer any illusion of victory. They were fighting for survival, not for Hitler, not for the fatherland, just to live one more day. As the Allies closed in from the west and the Soviet Red Army thundered in from the east, one chilling truth spread like wildfire through the ranks. Surrendering to the Americans might mean life. Falling into Soviet hands could mean death. It was early 1945, and the Third Reich was collapsing. The once mighty Wehrmacht, which had conquered half of Europe, was now a shadow of its former self. Hitler's promise of a 1,000-year empire had burned down to a few battered cities surrounded by enemies. The Eastern Front had become a nightmare. Villages that had once been full of German officers now echoed with cries of vengeance as the Red Army advanced. German soldiers had seen what happened when the Soviets took back their land. Towns burned to ground, prisoners executed, and civilians exacting their revenge for years of occupation. Those stories, passed from one retreating division to another, created a terror that words could hardly describe. By contrast, on the Western Front, there were whispers, almost rumors, of a different fate. American troops, though fierce in battle, were said to treat prisoners with decency. They fed them, gave them cigarettes, and sometimes even let them live in temporary camps with a sense of order. In a world collapsing into chaos, that sounded like salvation. So as the Reich crumbled, thousands of German soldiers made a single desperate choice. They would surrender to the Americans, no matter what it took. The roads leading west were filled with ragged columns of German troops, walking, limping, dragging themselves through the mud. Some carried makeshift white flags, bedsheets, shirts, anything that could signal surrender. Tanks smoldered along the roadsides. Horses lay dead in the fields, and columns of refugees, women, children, the elderly, moved alongside the soldiers. They all wanted the same thing, to reach the Americans before the Soviets did. The closer they got to the front, the more frantic it became. Whole divisions dissolved overnight. Officers no longer gave orders. They just tried to stay alive. Many soldiers threw away their weapons, burned their uniforms, or tore off insignia to hide their identities. In small towns across Germany, civilians watched the spectacle unfold in disbelief. They had been told for years that the Americans were monsters, that surrender meant death. But as rumors spread of American soldiers handing out chocolate, chewing gum, and kindness, the lies of Nazi propaganda began to crumble. For some, surrender wasn't just an act of desperation. It was an act of awakening. They realized that the war they had fought for so long had been built on deceit, and now, in its final days, the truth was setting them free in the strangest possible way. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler was sealed inside his bunker, barking orders to armies that no longer existed. He spoke of counterattacks that would never come, of divisions that had been wiped out weeks ago. But at the front lines, no one was listening anymore. German officers knew it was over. The Americans were crossing the Rhine. British forces were moving into northern Germany, and Soviet troops were pushing toward the capital with unstoppable fury. Between those two advancing walls, millions of German soldiers and civilians were trapped. Every passing day brought the same haunting question: which army will find us first? In the east, the situation had become apocalyptic. The Red Army's vengeance was brutal, shaped by years of suffering under Nazi occupation. German soldiers captured by the Soviets often vanished forever, shipped to labor camps in Siberia, where many never returned. Stories spread of executions, torture, and villages burned in revenge. Word of this reached the Western units like poison in the bloodstream. Soldiers who had once been loyal to Hitler now made secret pacts among themselves. When the time came, they would fight their way west, even if it meant abandoning their posts. Survival instincts took over as the moral fabric of the army collapsed. By March 1945, the German High Command was in disarray. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring tried to hold together the Western defenses, but he knew the men under his command no longer believed in victory. Some units surrendered en masse, waving white flags before the Americans even fired a shot. Others faked resistance just long enough to stage an honorable defeat before laying down their arms. American commanders quickly realized what was happening. Reports in front described scenes of surreal contrast. One day, fierce firefights. The next, thousands of Germans walking into captivity with hands raised, grateful that they were still alive. For the Americans, the sight was both strange and sobering. Many U.S. soldiers had expected bitter resistance, but instead they found columns of weary men, often teenagers or old men from the Volkssturm, surrendering without a fight. Some GIs couldn't believe it. After years of bloody combat in France and Belgium, they were now facing enemies who begged to be taken prisoner. The American military police struggled to process the flood of captives. Camps had to be built overnight. Fields turned into makeshift enclosures surrounded by barbed wire. In some areas, there were so many German prisoners that American divisions couldn't even feed them all at once. Yet, compared to the Eastern Front, it was still a mercy. Among those surrendering were not just common soldiers, but also high-ranking officers, SS men, and even generals. They all had the same goal: reach the Americans before the Soviets caught up. Some even forged American insignia or carried English phrases written on scraps of paper. "Don't shoot, I surrender," in hopes of avoiding misunderstanding during the chaos. There were reports of German officers abandoning their own troops to flee west in staff cars marked with red crosses, pretending to be medical vehicles. Others disguised themselves as civilians, hoping to blend into refugee columns. As April approached, Germany's defeat was undeniable. The Allies liberated one concentration camp after another, exposing the horrors that had been hidden for years. When the news spread, the American soldiers' attitudes hardened. Many began to see the Germans not just as defeated soldiers, but as participants in a vast crime. And yet, even then, the U.S. command maintained discipline. The mass surrenders continued, and millions of Germans found themselves behind barbed wire, alive, but uncertain what the future held. For many, captivity in an American camp meant years of hard labor, but compared to what awaited them under Soviet rule, it was still a blessing. Inside the German ranks, rumors and confusion reigned. Some believed the Americans would eventually ally with them against the Soviets, imagining a new front against communism. Others thought they could negotiate a partial surrender, keeping parts of Germany under Western control. But none of that mattered to the soldiers on the ground. They weren't thinking of politics anymore. They were thinking of food, safety, and a chance to see home again. Every sound of artillery from the east made them march faster toward the west. By the final weeks of April, as the Red Army encircled Berlin, the exodus reached its peak. Entire units crossed rivers under fire, abandoning their wounded and heavy equipment just to get closer to American lines. In some areas, American officers had to send patrols deep into Germany just to keep up with the flood of surrendering troops. There were even cases of German units fighting small skirmishes against other German forces, those trying to hold the line for Hitler versus those desperate to escape to the Americans. The war had devoured itself. What began as a campaign for domination had turned into chaos and flight. As night fell over Germany in those final days, the countryside glowed with distant fires. Columns of refugees trudged through the darkness, whispering prayers that they would reach the Americans by morning. In barns, ditches, and abandoned houses, German soldiers stripped off their insignia, buried their weapons, and waited for the sound of English voices. For them, that sound no longer meant the enemy. It meant hope. By May 1945, the end came swiftly. In the West, American and British forces had reached deep into German territory. Town after town fell without resistance. German commanders signed surrender documents, their faces hollow with exhaustion. Across the front, thousands of soldiers quietly handed over their rifles, raising their hands in relief. The long nightmare was over, at least for those who had made it to the right side of the front. The Americans processed millions of prisoners, organizing them into massive camps that stretched across Germany and France. Behind the wire fences, the defeated soldiers waited, uncertain their fate, but grateful to be alive. But not everyone made it. Thousands who couldn't reach the American lines in time were swept up by the Soviets. Their fate was darker. Trains packed with German prisoners rolled eastward into the unknown, disappearing into the vastness of Russia. The fear that had driven so many to flee west was proven right, and the stories that returned from those camps would haunt Germany for decades to come. For those who did surrender to the Americans, captivity was the beginning of another story, one filled with guilt, survival, and reflection. But in the spring of 1945, in those desperate final weeks, one thought united them all. Better to live behind American wire than die in a Soviet cell. And so, the roads to the West became rivers of surrender, carried with them the last broken pieces of Hitler's army, and the final, tragic chapter of the war. They could no longer fight. The war was over. But for millions of German soldiers who had surrendered to the Americans in 1945, the end of fighting did not mean the beginning of peace. It was the start of something uncertain, something they had not prepared for. Captivity, guilt, and survival in a world that had been destroyed. As the American lines expanded across Germany, the U.S. Army found itself facing an overwhelming problem. In just a few weeks, nearly 5 million German troops had laid down their arms. There were not enough guards, not enough food, not even enough space to hold them. The surrender that had saved so many lives was now creating a humanitarian crisis, unlike anything the Allies had ever faced. The Americans called them disarmed enemy forces, instead of prisoners of war. It was a legal distinction, but a crucial one. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war had specific rights: food rations, Red Cross access, and humane treatment. But by classifying the millions of surrendered Germans differently, the Allies could hold them without making promises they could not keep. For the soldiers inside those barbed wire fences, that difference was often invisible. They were alive, yes, but they were still trapped behind wire, under guard, unsure if they would ever go home again. In vast open fields across the Rhine and Moselle rivers, the Americans built temporary enclosures, simple fences of barbed wire surrounding acres of mud. The soldiers called them Rheinweisenlager, the Rhine meadow camps. There were no barracks, no roofs, and almost no shelter. The prisoners slept in holes they dug in the ground, covered with blankets or bits of canvas if they were lucky. Rain turned the fields into swamps. Sun turned them into dust. Disease spread quickly, and hunger was constant. For the men who had once fought across Europe, the irony was bitter. They had survived the war only to find themselves struggling to survive peace. Yet, even in these harsh conditions, there was an odd sense of relief. The guards were American, not Soviet. The men knew they were safe from execution or revenge killings. Some of the guards even shared cigarettes or rations when they could. Many American soldiers, barely older than the prisoners themselves, felt pity for the defeated men. They had fought fiercely just weeks earlier, but now they were little more than ghosts in tattered uniforms. The war had stripped them of everything: rank, pride, purpose, and what remained were human beings, broken and waiting. Among the prisoners, stories circulated endlessly. Some believed they would soon be released and sent home to rebuild Germany. Others whispered that they would be shipped to America as laborers. A few feared being handed over to the French or Soviets, who were known for harsher treatment. In the camps, rumor was as powerful as hunger. Every sound of a truck engine, every appearance of an American officer, sparked speculation. Days blurred into weeks. The fences became their world. In the nearby villages, the civilians watched silently. Many German towns were filled with ruins and widows, but even amid their own suffering, some tried to bring food or water to the prisoners. American guards sometimes allowed it. Sometimes they didn't. For the locals, seeing the defeated Wehrmacht behind wire was a shocking sight. These were the same men who, for years, had marched proudly through Europe. Now they stood barefoot in mud, begging for a crust of bread. The once invincible German army had been reduced to a sea of exhausted faces behind fences. The American command did its best to maintain order, but the scale was immense. General Eisenhower himself had visited the camps and ordered that the prisoners be fed and cared for as resources allowed, but shortages across Europe made it nearly impossible. The war had devastated infrastructure. Railways were destroyed, farms ruined, factories bombed. Feeding millions of surrendered soldiers was an impossible task when even liberated civilians were starving. Despite that, the Americans prevented the kind of mass slaughter that might have occurred elsewhere. It was chaotic, but not murderous. The goal was control, not revenge. Meanwhile, in the East, the Soviets were holding their own millions of prisoners under far worse conditions. Word of that continued to filter westward, reinforcing the prisoners' grim gratitude. Some German soldiers even wrote letters from the American camps, telling their families not to come east under any circumstances. They described the wire fences, the hunger, the waiting, but they also wrote something else. We are safe. For many families, that single phrase was enough to bring relief after years of fear. Life inside the camps settled into a strange routine. Every morning, the prisoners lined up for roll call, heads bowed under the watch of American sentries. They received a small ration, often bread, watery soup, or canned rations left from the front. Some carved spoons from wood, others made chess sets from stones, anything to keep their minds busy. They built crude shelters from branches and cloth. At night, they sang softly, songs from home, lullabies, hymns. In the darkness of those camps, they rediscovered something the war had almost erased: their shared humanity. Some American guards spoke German, and conversations began across the wire. The prisoners asked about the world beyond the fence, about the cities they once knew: Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne. They wanted to know what had survived and what hadn't. The Americans, many of whom had seen the destruction firsthand, hesitated to answer. They didn't want to tell them that their homes were gone, that their families might be dead, that their country no longer existed in the form they had known. The prisoners still called themselves soldiers of Germany, but there was no Germany anymore. Only ruins divided among victors. In late spring, the Allied command began to transfer some of the prisoners to labor camps in France, Britain, and the United States. Others were turned over to local authorities for reconstruction work, clearing debris, repairing roads, burying the dead. For these men, it was humiliating but bearable. They could work, they could eat, they could feel useful again. Some American officers saw this as a form of re-education, a way to break the old militarism and prepare the Germans to rebuild a democratic society. But for most prisoners, it was simply survival. They no longer cared about ideology or politics. They cared about getting through one more day. Meanwhile, back in the shattered remains of Germany, the people were waking up to the truth. The radio broadcasts of Hitler's last speeches had fallen silent. The swastikas were being pulled down. The concentration camps opened. The crimes revealed. For many of the prisoners, the news of what had been done in their nation's name came as a shock. Some refused to believe it. Others broke down in shame. Inside the camps, discussions began, quiet, uncertain, painful, about guilt and responsibility. These were the first seeds of reckoning that would later grow into Germany's long process of confronting its past. As summer approached, the American camps began to empty. Many prisoners were transferred to French, who used them as laborers in devastated regions. Some were sent to Britain, where they worked on farms and roads. A smaller number were transported across the Atlantic to the United States, where they lived in POW camps under far better conditions. Ironically, for some, captivity in America became the most peaceful period of their lives. They were fed well, treated fairly, and even allowed to attend English classes. Some later described those years as the moment they began to understand democracy, not from propaganda, but from experience. Those who remained in Germany faced a different reality. The American military government began to screen the prisoners, separating regular soldiers from SS members and war criminals. Interrogations were routine, and some men were terrified that they would be handed over to Soviet authorities. The line between survival and doom was thin. A wrong word, a wrong name, and a man could disappear eastward, never to return. But for the vast majority, release came slowly, in waves, as the Allies realized they could not hold millions of men indefinitely. By late 1946, many former soldiers had been released. They returned to towns that no longer existed, families scattered or gone. Their uniforms were gone, their insignia banned, their cause discredited. They returned not as heroes, but as reminders of a nightmare that Germany wanted to forget. And yet, among them, there remained a strange gratitude. The Americans had given them something no one else could have, a second chance. They had been spared the fate that had consumed so many in the East. That knowledge carried a heavy weight, a sense of both relief and shame. For the Americans who had guarded them, The experience was equally unforgettable. Many young GIs who had fought their way across Europe found themselves, suddenly, as caretakers for their former enemies. They watched the defeated soldiers rebuild their lives, and in many cases, friendships emerged years later. Some American guards and German prisoners exchanged letters long after the war. A few even met again in peacetime, shaking hands as equals. History, it seemed, had found a way to turn enemies into human beings again. But behind the fences of those camps, in 1945, none of that was certain. The men who had surrendered still carried the weight of the war in their hearts. They dreamed of home, of family, of forgiveness. Some prayed, others simply waited. Every sunrise over camp brought a reminder that they had survived when so many others hadn't. And though they were surrounded by wire, they knew something the dead could never know. The sound of silence after war, the feeling of being alive after the end of everything. In time, their stories would fade into history. But for those who lived through it, the memory of that desperate race to surrender, to find the Americans before the Soviets, never left them. It was a choice that had saved their lives, the moment when survival overcame ideology, when the human instinct to live outshone the madness of war. They had fought for a cause that destroyed them, but in surrendering, they had rediscovered what it meant to be human. And so, as the camps emptied and the world began to rebuild, the German soldiers who had once feared the Americans came to see them not as conquerors, but as the thin line between life and oblivion. Their desperation to surrender had been born of fear. But in the end, it gave them something far greater than victory could ever offer, the chance to live, to remember, and to begin again. In the months after Germany's surrender, the war no longer echoed with gunfire, but its ghosts lingered everywhere. Across Europe, the wreckage of the Third Reich was not just in the cities and fields. It was in the hearts of those who had survived. For millions of former German soldiers, the surrender that had once seemed like salvation now became something heavier. The burden of remembering. They had escaped death. Yes, but not the memory of what they had seen, done, or lost. The war had ended, but it refused to let them go. Many of those who had surrendered to the Americans were eventually released and sent back to what was left of Germany. The journey home was long and silent. They walked or rode in trucks through landscapes they barely recognized. Towns reduced to rubble, bridges collapsed, fields still littered with burned-out tanks. Along the way, they saw the faces of civilians who looked at them not as heroes, but as reminders of everything that had gone wrong. For years, the German people had been told they were fighting for destiny, for greatness. Now they stood among ruins, wondering what any of it had been for. The men who returned from American captivity found themselves strangers in their own country. Some came back to find their families alive but broken. Others found nothing but empty houses. Entire villages had been wiped from the map. Wives and mothers told stories of surviving bombings, of hiding from invading troops, of scraping together what little food they could find. And in the ruins of Berlin and Hamburg, hunger became a new kind of enemy. Bread was scarce, coal even scarcer. For those who had fought for years, the hardest battle was simply staying alive in peace. Yet many still spoke of the Americans with a strange respect. They told others how, in the camps, the guards had shared cigarettes, how they had been treated not as beasts, but as men. In the broken world that followed the war, that small mercy mattered. It was one of the few lights in a dark time. For many German veterans, that experience planted the first seeds of understanding, an idea that decency could survive even in war, and that perhaps the future of Germany would depend on rebuilding trust rather than walls. But not all returned whole. Some had seen too much, done too much. They carried with them the weight of what had been revealed after the war. The camps, the mass graves, the crimes committed in their country's name. Some denied it. Others couldn't stop thinking about it. They wondered if surrender had saved them only to make them face a truth they could never escape. The soldiers who had once believed they were fighting for honor now had to ask themselves, what were we really fighting for? And what had it cost? For many, the shame was unbearable. They avoided talking about the war, hiding their uniforms and medals in attics or burning them outright. They told their children little or nothing. A whole generation of German fathers carried silent memories of 1945, of the race to the American lines, of the fear of the Soviets, of the moment they dropped their weapons and realized it was over. They didn't speak of it, but it haunted them all the same. Among the Americans, too, there were memories that didn't fade. Many young soldiers who had fought through France and into Germany had seen unimaginable destruction. Some had helped liberate concentration camps. Others had watched as German civilians struggled to survive. The same men who had fought the Wehrmacht now found themselves giving food to the same people they had been told were enemies. In that strange post-war world, hatred began to soften into something else. Understanding, perhaps even pity. Some American soldiers wrote home about it. "They're just people," one GI wrote. "Hungry, tired people. Just like us, if the world had gone another way." For a generation raised in total war, it was a profound realization. And for Germany, it marked the beginning of something unexpected: reconciliation. In the years that followed, many of the German prisoners who had experienced American captivity spoke openly of it. They described how their treatment had changed their view of the world. Some of them later became teachers, writers, or politicians in the new West Germany. They carried with them the belief that democracy and decency were not weaknesses, but strengths. In that way, the desperate surrender of 1945 did more than save lives. It helped shape the moral rebirth of a nation. Still, the wounds of the war ran deep. The stories of those who had not made it, the ones captured by the Soviets, the ones lost in the East, cast a long shadow. Families were divided between zones of occupation. Letters took months or years to reach their destinations, and rumors spread of loved ones still alive in camps far away. Some returned from Soviet captivity a decade later, gaunt and silent, their eyes hollow. Others never came back at all. The difference between surrendering to the Americans and to the Soviets had been the difference between life and death. In the quiet evenings of the late 1940s, across the ruins of Germany, men sat in silence with those memories. They didn't boast of battles anymore. They talked of luck, of the American patrol they had met on the road, of the white flag they had raised just in time, of the cigarette that had been offered instead of a bullet. For them, survival itself was the only victory left. And yet, even amid the ruins, a strange new hope began to grow. The same American soldiers who had guarded German prisoners were now helping to rebuild German towns. The Marshall Plan brought food and aid, and former enemies began working side by side. The hatred that had fueled the war slowly gave way to cooperation. By the early 1950s, West Germany stood again, not as a conqueror, but as a partner in a new Europe. Those who had once fled to surrender now found themselves living under protection of the same power they had once fought. It was a transformation almost too great to believe. But for the men who had stood in the mud of 1945, who had raised their hands and prayed for mercy, it was proof that history could change, and that humanity, even after the darkest times, could rebuild itself. Decades later, when those old soldiers were asked what they remembered most about the war's end, few spoke of battles. They spoke of moments. The first American they saw who didn't shoot, the sound of a Jeep engine instead of artillery, the simple act of being given water after days of running. Those small mercies stayed with them for life. They were the proof that even in the ashes of war, compassion could survive. For some, the memory of surrender was bittersweet. It was the moment they lost everything they believed in, but also the moment they regained their humanity. When they raised their hands to the Americans, they weren't just giving up a fight. They were stepping out of madness. And though history would judge their nation harshly, many of those men carried a quiet sense of gratitude for the chance to live on, to remember, and to help rebuild a better world. In the end, the story of 1945 wasn't just about defeat. It was about awakening, the moment when millions realized that the war they had fought for power and glory had led only to ruin, and that the real victory was in the simple act of choosing life over death, mercy over vengeance. The roads that once echoed with retreat and desperation became, in time, the roads of rebuilding, lined with people who had learned the hardest lesson of all, that surrender, in its truest form, can sometimes be the beginning of peace. In the years that followed the end of the Second World War, the world changed faster than anyone could have imagined. The guns had fallen silent, but the memory of their thunder still echoed in every corner of Europe. Germany was divided, East and West, Soviet and American, captive and free. For those who had once been soldiers of the Reich, the line that saved their lives in 1945 now became the line that divided their nation. And yet, amid that division, something extraordinary began to happen. From the ruins of war and surrender, a new kind of strength was born. The men who had once thrown away their weapons and walked toward the Americans returned to a Germany that barely existed. There were no parades to welcome them, no cheers, no flags. The war had stripped the country of pride and left behind only questions. But those questions, painful as they were, became the foundation of something new. They forced a nation to look inward, to face what it had done and what it had become. And from that reckoning came the quiet resolve to build a different future, one where power would never again be worshipped above humanity. Many of the soldiers who had surrendered carried with them memories of kindness that contrasted sharply with the brutality of the years before. They remembered American soldiers who shared food, who treated them fairly, who looked them in the eye and saw not monsters, but men. That experience stayed with them for decades. It shaped how they raised their children, how they spoke about the war, and how they thought about their place in the world. When the new West Germany began to rise in the 1950s, built on democracy and cooperation, many of those who had once been desperate to surrender became its quiet supporters. They had seen what hatred led to, and they wanted no part of it ever again. For the Americans, too, the war left deep marks. The soldiers who had fought their way across Europe, who had seen cities destroyed and people broken, returned home changed. They had faced the worst of humanity, but also glimpsed its resilience. Many of them later spoke about the strained compassion they felt toward the defeated enemy. They had fought the Nazis, but when the war ended, they saw the Germans not as villains, but as victims of a system that had consumed everything in its path. That understanding became part of America's post-war mission, not just to punish, but to rebuild, to help Europe rise again from its own ashes. Through that rebuilding, former enemies became partners. The same Germany that had once sworn to destroy the West became one of its strongest allies. In factories and schools, on farms and in cities, people worked side by side with Americans, British, and French soldiers. The barbed wire that had once separated them gave way to bridges, trade routes, and friendships. And though the scars of war never fully faded, something new took root: trust. It was fragile at first, but it grew stronger with every passing year. Still, the memory of those desperate final weeks of 1945 never disappeared. Old soldiers, long after the war, could still recall the feeling of running west, of hearing the distant artillery from the Red Army, of seeing the first white stars on American tanks, of realizing that they had survived. They remembered the faces of men who didn't make it, who were captured by the Soviets or died on the road. They remembered the way to surrender, the mix of fear, shame, and relief that flooded through them when they raised their hands. For many, that moment defined their entire lives. As the decades passed, historians began to understand what those choices had meant. The mass surrender of German troops to the Western Allies was one of the largest in human history. In the final months of the war, entire divisions laid down their arms without a fight. It wasn't an act of courage or cowardice. It was a recognition of humanity in the midst of destruction. They knew the war was lost. But more than that, they had realized that survival itself was an act of defiance against the madness that had consumed their nation. Some of those who surrendered would later speak to school children about what they had learned. They told them not of victories, but of mistakes. They told them how easy it was to believe lies when those lies promised glory. They told them about fear of the Soviets, fear of death, fear of truth, and how that fear had driven millions to do terrible things. And they told them that in the end, when everything else was gone, the only thing that mattered was compassion. There were also those who could never speak about it. The trauma of the war ran too deep. They carried their memories silently through years of rebuilding and prosperity. They smiled at family gatherings, worked in offices or factories, but at night the past returned. The mud, the wire, the sound of planes overhead. The moment of surrender replayed in their minds, not as a scene of weakness, but as the instant they stepped back into life. As Europe rebuilt, the world moved on to new conflicts: the Cold War, Korea, Vietnam. But for those who had lived through the collapse of 1945, no war could ever seem the same again. They had seen what total destruction looked like, and they understood that no ideology, no flag, no leader was worth the price of such ruin. They had surrendered not only to the Americans, but to the truth that war at its core was a failure of humanity itself. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, many of those men were old. Some lived to see their divided country reunified, to see the line they had once raced toward finally disappear. When they watched American and German leaders shake hands as equals, they saw the fulfillment of something they had only dreamed of in 1945, a Germany that was free, democratic, and at peace with its neighbors. It was the world they had hoped to live in when they laid down their guns and prayed for mercy. In interviews and memoirs, some of those veterans spoke softly about that day of surrender. They said it was the moment they stopped being soldiers and became men again. They said it was the day they learned that strength wasn't in conquest, but in compassion. They said it was the day they began to understand what peace truly meant. And for all the pain, all the loss, all the guilt, that lesson was the one thing they carried to the end of their lives. Today, 80 years later, the story of those desperate surrenders is often forgotten amid the larger history of the war, but it remains one of its most human chapters. In those final weeks of chaos, millions of men faced an impossible choice, and they chose life. They chose to walk away from death, to lay down their weapons, to trust their enemies, and in doing so, they helped lay the first stones of a bridge that would carry Europe from ruin to renewal. The war had begun with a dream of domination, and ended with an act of surrender. But in that surrender was a seed of something powerful, the understanding that peace begins where pride ends, that mercy is stronger than hatred, and that even in defeat there can be dignity. As the last survivors of that generation fade into memory, their stories remain a reminder to us all that no matter how dark the times, no matter how great the fear, the choice to act with humanity, to see the enemy as human, is the only choice that ever truly wins. And so, when we look back at those desperate German soldiers in the spring of 1945, hungry, frightened, walking toward the American lines with white flags made from torn shirts, we should not see only the end of a war. We should see the fragile beginning of peace. Because in their surrender, the world was given a chance to begin again. That is the story of the spring of 1945, the story of how an army that had once brought destruction across continents learned, in its final days, the value of mercy. The story of men who fled not for glory, but for life. And in that desperate race to surrender, they unknowingly helped rebuild the world they had tried to destroy. The war ended not with triumph, but with understanding, not with victory, but with survival. And from that survival came the quiet hope that still guides us today, that no matter how far humanity falls, it can always find its way back.